29 minutes to 7. This is Classic Business and Classic Government brought to you by Telkom. Good evening, I'm Glenn Lewington. Tonight we conclude our discussion on electricity supply in our country, Eskom, and the future of electrical, or rather power, in the country. Just some of the fact check that I can share with you tonight. We've been talking about how much of coal-powered stations, or how many there are, and how much electricity is actually derived from coal. Well, it's about 95%. And most of our coal-powered stations are in Mpumalanga. There are others around the country, but the bulk of the 13 on the Mpumalanga Highveld. And those power stations are Arnott, well, our coal-powered stations in the country are Arnott, Duva, Hendrina, Kendal, which is our largest, generating 4,116 megawatts, Kriel, Letabo, Majuba, Matimba, Matla, Tutuka, Camden, Grootvlei, and Komati, and of course our nuclear power station in the Western Cape is Koeberg. We have two hydroelectric and pumped storage systems. That's the Drakensberg pumped storage scheme, which can generate 1,000 megawatts. Palmit pumped storage scheme can generate 400 megawatts. We also have Garib and the Van der Kloof water projects. On gas turbines, we have Acacia, Port Rex and Ankerlig, which is Atlantis open cycle gas turbines, and lastly Gorikwa in Mossel Bay. So those are our power stations that are active in the country at the moment. Another regulator within, or rather a group within the power industry in South Africa, is the South African Independent Power Producers Association, the SAIPPA. And I spoke to Doug Cooney, Managing Director of the association, of what the actual role of it is and what he sees the future in South Africa in terms of electric power. Doug, what exactly is the South African Independent Power Producers Association?
The SAIPPA is a lobby organization, and it was formed with the intention of lobbying regulators, legislators, lawmakers, and policymakers to arrive at a landscape that is free and fair for all power producers. So in other words, it requires that there is free and fair competition amongst power producers.
And the power producers as such, when we talk about a power producer, an IPP, they don't have much of an option but to sell to Eskom into the national grid. Would that be incorrect?
No, that's quite accurate, but that was not what was contained in the policy paper of 1998. The 98 paper was quite clear. There should be competition introduced in generation. The transmission grid and operation should be separated from Eskom. And there should be customer choice. None of these have ever been implemented since the paper was produced in 1998.
Why do you think that is?
Well, we are quite perplexed because we've had a number of interactions, and the interactions have, even if in our presentations to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, we have been asking why the policy has not been implemented.
And no reasonable answer to that?
Well, it appears that the Department of Energy, and in consultation with various players in the power field, have decided that everything needs to be centrally controlled. And
what is the role of Eskom now as opposed to, let's say, 15 years ago? How's it changed?
Well, what's happened is, if we go back 15 years, that was the last capital expansion program when it came to an end. Eskom then had to contend with prevarication in government about new build, and they only placed orders for new capacity in 2006, which was hopelessly late. Because in 2007 we had the first blackout, and then in 2008 they were forced in January to shut down the mining industry for 2 weeks. So we were already hopelessly late. Eskom then went ahead and they placed orders for Medupi and Kusile and Ingula. So Eskom's hands are actually currently tied because they have to finish the new build program. In the meantime, the Department of Energy has produced the IRP 10, and according to that plan, they have projected what the power needs are going to be up to the year 2030. However, the method which they are using to implement the plan means that Eskom has got no competition in terms of its power. IPPs will compete with each other on procurement programs being run by the Department of Energy.
The Department of Energy and Eskom, do you think there's synergy between the two, or sometimes they're speaking at different levels and lengths?
I think the whole power complex is very confusing, if you ask me. And the reason I'm saying that is because you have, quite frankly, too many fingers in the pie. The regulation is done by NERSA. The financing and the support for Eskom comes from the Ministry of Finance. The shareholder of Eskom is the Department of Public Enterprises. The policy is done by the Department of Energy. And there isn't a single conductor of the orchestra.
Mm. And if you look ahead to Eskom in 2030, what do you see?
Well, I'm afraid my predictions are not very optimistic, simply because we have an uncertain tariff path, and the tariff path is extremely steep at the moment. Eskom's current build is running late, and the later the build runs, the more Eskom's debt mounts, and the question is, how is the debt being financed? One of the problems is, and the Eskom CFO reported to Parliament, that one of their issues is servicing debt.
Doug, can you explain just very simply how Eskom is actually financed? If they weren't to push up tariffs, how would they be getting their money?
Well, quite frankly, Eskom has only two means of raising capital, either the consumer or through the shareholder. Now, previously, Eskom's balance sheet was strong enough for them to go to market, issuing Eskom bonds, and in that manner, they raised their long-term financing for capital expansions. The Eskom balance sheet currently is too weak to do that, and so they required a government guarantee in order to go and raise loans to complete the current new build. Government has provided a guarantee of 350 billion, and Eskom has got this guarantee to go out and raise loans in order to finance the new build. The issue really is the budget sufficient for them to complete the new build? Is the 350 billion sufficient? If the current delays and the cost overruns are of such a magnitude that Eskom does not have any other means of raising the capital, then it has to come from the tariff.
Mm. Doug, as an independent power producer, if we don't have a privatized electricity supply, in this case Eskom, the benefit to the country in terms of an IPP is just that it will supplement Eskom. It won't actually be of benefit to the consumer then, because Eskom surely can then just charge whatever they want anyway, because it's not private, regardless whether there's IPPs or not.
Well, electricity is regulated, so it's price regulated. But the question is, who carries Eskom's risk? And to date, it's the consumer that carries the risk. If you look at the tariff path, Eskom looks at what its needs are in terms of revenue, and that risk is then passed on to the consumer. An IPP has to bid in a price at the start of any bidding process. It's then locked into that price for the period of the power purchase agreement. If an IPP had to build Medupi, for instance, it would have abandoned the project because the cost overruns are now so huge it could not pay back for it. So the issue is IPPs have to mitigate their risks. They have to plan their projects quite meticulously because they get locked into a power purchase agreement at the beginning before their lenders will give them the money to build the project.
Doug, have you got an example of another country in the world that's, hopefully similar to South Africa, where they have different means of selling and generating electricity that's successful?
Well, there are many examples. The UK is an example where it has an independent grid, and power producers sell into the grid. New Zealand is another example. There are many examples where the issue is that if the generator owns the grid, you have a conflict of interest. If the grid is independent, then the grid allows independent power producers access to the grid, and they can sell to private off-takers or they can sell to a central buyer. But then you have true competition because all generators are competing with each other.
Do you believe Eskom would exist if it was privatized in its current form? Would it actually just be downscaled?
That's not an easy question to answer because the privatization of Eskom would not be an easy matter to execute, primarily because Eskom's fleet is largely coal-fired. And the older coal-fired stations do not have mitigation in terms of emissions. The new stations, which are Medupi and Kusile, have got flue gas desulfurization, and they would be able to be privatized, of course, if the economics were correct. But the older stations would be very difficult because the lenders would not lend money to finance those privatizations unless you retrofitted them with flue gas cleaning equipment.
Can you explain what that very scientific term is?
Yes, the gases which come out through the chimneys, one needs to extract from them the sulfur. So, at the moment, the only things that are extracted at the moment are all the particulate matter, but the sulfur is not extracted.
Now, that sulfur, when it's released into the atmosphere, and I'm talking about Mpumalanga, where you see where many of our power stations are,
yes,
surely that would affect the weather patterns and the clouds and the rain?
I'm not an expert on weather, Glenn.
But surely sulfur going up into the atmosphere is not a good thing.
Well, I think if you look at World Bank emission standards, that's why Medupi and Kusile are being built with flue gas desulfurization. That's the requirement now.
And the actual cost, if those power stations, as you're saying, to be privatized, they'd have to be modernized, which is going to cost money. How much to actually make them more environmentally friendly? Are we talking billions?
Easily.
So it actually would pay to actually build other types of power stations, if not another coal-fired station?
Well, coal is our most abundant primary fuel. But in the last few years, the landscape in southern Africa has changed dramatically with the advent of bountiful gas finds in natural gas. And the IRP is in fact dated because it doesn't account for the gas finds in southern Africa currently. This is going to change the landscape of power generation in southern Africa.
And that's going to be my final question to you, Doug. And we were having this debate last night. I gave it a prediction, what is it going to look like in 300 years? Most panelists said in 50 years, South Africa's landscape in terms of what we power electricity with will change. What is your opinion?
Agreed.
What are we going to be powered with?
Well, I think the most likely candidate and the easiest and the most rapid expansion that can take place, which is incidentally also very good for the grid in South Africa, would be the introduction of combined cycle gas-fired power stations.
Doug Cooney, Managing Director, South African Independent Power Producers Association. Thank you for your time on Classic Business and Classic Government.
Growing a business is like a journey. You know where you want to go, but you don't always know the best way to get there. To reach your goals, you need the right partner who will walk with you no matter what. That's why I'm with Nedbank. They know it's not just me and my business on this journey, but also my employees, my business partners, my family, and my community.
To experience the benefits of Nedbank's distinctive financial solutions, email business@nedbank.co.za or find us on Twitter or LinkedIn. Partnering for growth for a greater South Africa. Make things happen. Nedbank. We're an authorized financial services and credit provider.
Die ZEW-Konjunkturerwartungen für Deutschland sind im Juli 2012
中国的 GDP 在2012年的上半年以 7.8% 的速度增长。
Investing offshore can be daunting unless you choose the right investment partner. Investec Asset Management's award-winning Global Strategic Managed Fund makes sense of complex offshore investment options by seeking out the best opportunities. By balancing your investments across global equities, bonds and cash, the Global Strategic Managed Fund makes the difficult decisions for you, aiming to minimize risk and maximize returns. If opportunity is there, we'll find it. For more information, contact your financial advisor, call us on 0860 555 700 or visit investecassetmanagement.com. Investec Asset Management is an authorized financial services provider.
14 minutes to 7. Classic Business and Classic Government is brought to you by Telkom. I'd like to introduce our guests this evening. On the phone line is Claire Falkveen, Program Director for African Utility Week. Good evening to you, Claire. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks very much for having me.
Niels van Haase, CEO, Solsquare. Niels, nice to have you with us. Good evening to you.
Good evening to you and to your listeners.
Thank you. Tristan Taylor, Project Coordinator at Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. Nice to have you with us, Tristan.
Thank you for having us.
And Hilary Joffe, Spokesperson at Eskom. Hilary, nice to have you with us. Good evening to you.
Thanks very much, Glenn.
Claire, if I may start with you, can you tell us a bit about African Utility Week?
African Utility Week is a conference and exhibition which takes place on an annual basis in South Africa, and it's been going for the last 13 years. And the aim of the event really is to bring together utilities from across the continent with the aim of learning from one another and hopefully preventing a duplication of effort on behalf of a lot of those utilities so that they can learn from each other's mistakes or successes. And so we bring together a variety of people, manufacturers, regulators, utility CEOs from across the continent and the world. And we meet for 3 days of fairly intense and rigorous discussion.
What do you, when you have these fairly intensive discussions, what is the most common aggravation or problem echoed about electrical supply of power in the country?
I think at the moment, probably the issues that have been coming up, not just in South Africa, but across the continent with a lot of the people that I've spoken with, have been around tariffs. From the utility perspective, obviously tariffs are always a concern, not just because of the fact that they are in a position where they're having to try and recover costs, but also because of the social impact of tariffs very often. Safety is always an issue, and the financing of power sector development, be it grid extensions or building new generation capacity, and then one that unfortunately the engineering sector worldwide is experiencing, that is a very definite lack of skills.
Interesting. Hilary, from an Eskom perspective, and we were talking before we went on air, and I thought it was a very interesting point you made, and I think Claire's just raised it, people moaning about rises in prices, but you made a very interesting point, and a lot of people don't actually give that as credit to Eskom, is that the process is actually a very public process. It's not like that in many other countries.
What we've tried to do is put as much information out there to empower debate, because we're fortunate really in that we have a credible and independent regulator which conducts a very public process before it makes its decision. So the regulator has called for submissions by the 20th of November, and it will then scrutinize them, and then we'll have 2 weeks of public hearings all around the country in January. So I hope that we've put our case out there, and we really do urge people to engage with our application and to take advantage of the process.
How do they take advantage of that? And often, as people listening to this now, they think, well, how do I express my like, dislike, concern?
You make a submission to the National Energy Regulator. You can go on their website and find out how to send your submission in. Not all the people who make submissions get to speak at the public hearings. I think the regulator you could perhaps have on your show another time to talk about the process. We're also actually at the moment with the regulator doing a round of radio shows in all the official languages, because we and they see it as quite important that we reach all around the country with this tariff application, so that everywhere people can at least feel that they have the ability to be part of it and have their say.
This increase that we're going to be getting effective from next year, so it's not cast in stone as of yet. It's an application.
We crunch our numbers, and we have done formidable number crunching. We've done a lot of very, very careful work, and it's really been a challenging balancing act, if you like, to balance the country's different priorities, because first and foremost, as a country, we need a secure and stable supply of electricity, without which we cannot grow, without which we cannot create jobs, without which we cannot extend access to electricity to all. So that's really a priority, and for that we need a sustainable, financially sustainable electricity industry and Eskom, which means that we have to be able to cover the full costs of producing electricity. But at the same time, we are mindful of the impact which tariff increases have on the economy, and particularly on poorer households. So we have sought to find the balance between all of those different imperatives, and our application is the product of that balancing act. We believe we found the right balance, but as a country, there are choices that need to be made. And I hope we've put the numbers on the table so that those choices can be talked about.
Can you talk more about the numbers so we get an understanding of what the 16% actually will be used for?
We have applied for 13% to cover Eskom's own costs. Now, that is on the one hand our operating costs, which are number one, coal, which is our largest single cost. Also maintenance of our power stations so that they can perform, and we need to do more and more maintenance because they are somewhat aging. And staff costs. People ask us, why can't you just have electricity prices which are in line with inflation? But our costs, particularly of coal and of maintenance, are rising above inflation. Coal's been rising at 18% a year. We have negotiated contracts and worked on that, and we projecting 10% a year, but that's still above inflation. Likewise with maintenance costs, staff costs, we've kept to in line with inflation, but we're a growing organization. We're connecting new customers. We're increasing our capacity by 50%. So we have provided for some growth. That's the operating costs on the one hand. On the other hand, we are embarked on, I think it's probably the largest infrastructure build program the country has ever done. We need to be able to finance the building of those new power stations, and the application has to cater for those costs, which it does. Now, that's the 13%.
Are we talking the three power stations?
3 power stations, Medupi, Kusile, Ingula, the transmission network that goes with that. But also there's a lot of other capital spending which we are doing. Not only the new build, which is expanding capacity, but also upgrading and refurbishing existing power stations and existing power lines, extending and strengthening distribution networks, extending the transmission network so that we can, for example, among other things, accommodate more renewables producers which are coming onto the grid. Now, that is the 3%, the extra 3%. So Eskom's own needs 13%. Plus 3% to bring in for the first time large-scale renewable energy producers, private sector power producers onto the grid over the next 5 years. And that process is now well underway, led by the Department of Energy. So we have provided for the costs of that new renewable power in our application. And that really is how we got to the 16%. And I think the numbers are quite transparently set out in our application.
Niels, you're nodding your head.
Yes, by and large, I think I do agree with what Hilary says. What is very interesting to me in this whole debate of costing the effect of renewable energy on the consumer, if you so want to call it at the end of the day, the 3% really sounds like a very large number. But at the end of the day, we are looking at NERSA having allocated a rather small amount of generation to the network. In terms of the power that's allocated to renewable energy over the entire generation capacity that will be needed in the near future and should be made available to South African consumers, the economy, and Eskom at the end of the day to increase their reserve margins.
Tristan, your thoughts?
I think there's still some rotten areas within Eskom's tariff structure that actually need to be addressed, and they're playing themselves out now. I'm getting a distinct feeling of deja vu with MYPD3. When MYPD1 came around, one of our big applications to NERSA, we communicated this to Eskom as well, was that coal costs are going to rise. We are not on the easy side of the resource curve on coal. We are now in the much harder to mine, much more expensive, dirtier, less calorific resource curve. So our coal costs are, it's inevitably going to rise over the next 50 years. So it makes coal less and less of an economically attractive bet. We've seen huge cost overruns at Eskom, which I've yet to hear a really credible opinion for. I mean, we've gone from, Medupi's almost doubled, well, actually more than doubled in price. I remember Hilary's predecessor, Fani Zulu, sending out a media statement saying it's around about 60 billion for Medupi. So, and Kusile is the same. Ingwela looks like it's also gone cost overruns. So those are something which needs to be addressed with Eskom. And if Eskom can't address it itself, well, then the regulator must do it, and if the regulator can't do it, then the shareholder must do it, which is the Department of Public Enterprises. So there's a governance issue on that. We've pushed hard over the last 6 years on the special purchasing agreements that Eskom has had. I see that they've kicked their last big one to touch. They've sent it to NERSA. But there's a lot of secrecy issues which don't make this such of a public process as they sometimes could be addressed. For one of the things is a battle that not only we've had, but civil society, political structures, economists have had on how much does BHP Billiton get its electricity for? We've had a court case on the matter. We still don't know what the revised contracts with Anglo and BHP Billiton, what the costs are there, although something did go briefly up on NERSA's website, probably by mistake, I think, which priced it at the cost of hydro. If that's the case, then they're probably getting some of the cheaper electricity around. So those issues are fundamental, because if Eskom's losing 5 billion rand a year, effectively all the rest of us must subsidize that loss. And those agreements are outside of NYPD descriptions. So there's some fundamental economic imperatives that would probably lessen the burden on the South African consumer if we got those right. And so we hope that, Eskom will get them right, and if they don't, then the NERSA must step in in a much more forceful way than NERSA has done before. I mean, NERSA has generally looked at Eskom and said, can Eskom make a profit or not, and made its price determination on that. NERSA actually needs to go a little bit step farther in its regulation, and as we were discussing prior to the program, there's some doubts whether the Department of Energy is going to allow NERSA to do that with impending legislation. Sorry, excuse me. So we've got some serious issues that we actually must address. And also there's some other issues which are going back, and they're very technical issues because they have to deal with the government's plan on the Integrated Resource Plan 2010 and the costing that's in the NYPD3 and the capital costs of power stations. Those two differ. In particular, the nuclear cost, the planned nuclear build, significant difference. I mean, the difference is roughly about $2,000 a kilowatt in their capital costs. So when DOE did the Integrated Resource Plan, they were using different capital costs that are now emerging out of the NYPD process, which is very good of Eskom to bring them to us, because now that highlights that in the model there says the best cost-effective option was X based on these costs. Now, if those costs have changed, the entire model possibly changes when you put it into the computer program and it comes out with a different result. But Eskom is now implementing the IRP. So it could be implementing it based on a cost model that is completely off-kilter, in which case we may not be getting the best mix for South Africa. And it's a big bet. I mean, Eskom is now talking 3 trillion rand. They're talking 3.5 trillion rand of capital expenditure that we're going to have to make on our energy system. So it's probably worth Eskom joining the rest of us and saying that the DO must do another IRP and really soon.
Hilary, your response? That's quite a lot.
That is quite a lot, yeah. I thought I'd just keep on going.
Our application itself is designed to keep the lights on for now, to make sure that we have the electricity that we need now, and to build the new capacity that we need, that we're building out to 2018 to keep the lights on now and into the future. And,
is it that serious when you say keep the lights on?
Indeed, I think we've said many times that this is a very tight power system and will be for quite some time until we get a lot of new capacity online.
And is the word crisis exaggerating it?
Crisis is exaggerating it because I think we are, as Eskom, managing a very tight system. And we're managing it, I hope, in partnership with South Africans, and we urge South Africans to work with us. We have help from our large customers. We have help from our small customers to some extent. We are determined to keep the lights on, but we've not made any secret of the fact that it comes at some cost, and it is sometimes a nightly challenge. So I think that is reflected to some extent in that application. First of all, the extent to which we have, to whatever extent we can, brought in the private sector power producers, non-Eskom power that we have already. The energy efficiency incentives which we have applied for and have been paying for as Eskom are because as a country we need to become more energy efficient for a variety of reasons, but in the very short term that we need demand reductions which will enable us to manage the system and keep the lights on. So keeping
Hilary,
the lights on is really at the core of it. But
I just need to take a short break, so I'm going to ask if I can switch you off for just 1 minute. Classic Business and Classic Government, brought to you by Telkom. Classic Business and Classic Government, brought to you by Telkom. Hilary, sorry to interrupt you.
That's good, yeah. So we provided for now and for our own new bill that we're already committed to and for some of the new independent power producers which are coming in. But what we have not actually applied for is the long term. Now that is where the integrated resource plan comes in, because decisions have not yet been made on that plan. It's not for us to implement it, it is for government to implement it, but for the most part those decisions have not been made. We are waiting for guidance on what our role will be as Eskom, and therefore we did not include the long term, for example, the future nuclear, which the government has in mind, the future coal and renewables, which the government has in mind in terms of the plan. What we did do, though, is we wanted to give South Africans a sense of what our needs might be as a country out for the next 20 years in line with the plan. And we therefore modeled various scenarios of what it could mean for tariffs if the plan were to be implemented. So we've shown those numbers, but we did not include them in our actual application. But I think if one is talking about security of supply and the need for a growing and successful country and what kind of capacity will we need in the longer term, that is certainly a conversation which we need to have, and I hope that we've given the numbers which enable us to start having that conversation.
Claire, have you got any point to make at this stage?
I think the only thing that I would say is that, price determination is never a simple issue, because any utility and a regulator, especially in a situation like we have in South Africa, where we only have a single generator to the most effect, is never as simple as just looking at the costs and putting out a price. There are always societal costs which have to be taken into account. And I've been quite interested to hear the fact that there have been many comments on the fact that electricity in South Africa is becoming too expensive. And, I do agree that to a point we are having to adjust to the fact that prices are increasing. But at the same time, there are a lot of mechanisms in place which are protecting the poor, which are ensuring that they are getting electricity free of charge, that there is cross-subsidization taking place from some of the heavier users of electricity on a domestic side. So I don't think that this is necessarily also a case of, woe to the consumer. But I do also believe that as consumers, particularly in a South African perspective, we need to become more energy efficient. We are incredibly wasteful of our electricity. And the more efficient we become, the more we are actually able to take control in terms of how we spend our money and not place the blame on companies like Eskom or the regulator. We have to take back the responsibility.
If I actually just raise a point made by Wayne Sampson, the CEO of Ellie's, I think it was on Tuesday, which I thought was a very interesting point. And he's saying South Africans must accept that we're living in a completely different country to what we did 25 years ago. And with that, obviously, we need to look at the fact that electricity is not cheap anymore. And one of the ways for us to adjust to that is to actually cut back and learn how to use it efficiently.
Absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. The reality is that for many years, we as South Africans have lived in a situation where the electricity prices that we've had have not been reflective of any sort of reality. There was a lot of investment done in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and the tariffs were kept artificially low because we were trying to encourage economic growth and development. But if we're wanting to continue developing, there has to be a cost associated with it. We cannot continue booming as an economy and not have any of the consequences of that growth. This is the reality. We have to start monitoring our own energy usage and taking responsibility for our own bills, and not just blaming price increases.
That's what I'd like to bring Niels in, because Niels, you work with solar power. We've heard a lot about solar power, and if you can also, as you specialize in that, the reality and the expense of putting solar power, and I know you gave me a good example about a sharp nail, but obviously when you say to a person, put in a solar geyser or solar electricity, and you give them the bill to put this in, it's a lot of money.
Yes, indeed, it is a lot of money. I just wanted to pick up on one point before I respond to that directly, though, that Claire made, and those are the societal costs of the current electricity generation. An interesting side fact, we are the second most coal-dependent country in the world after China, and the government has recently introduced the concept of a carbon tax. Now, the carbon tax really is a measure to take into account the societal environmental cost of using coal or fossil resources to generate power and to power our lives at the end of the day. Now, in the 16% that Eskom has asked for now for the next 5 years, those societal costs and environmental costs are not factored in. So if you add that on top of what we're paying at the moment, the real cost of using traditional resources to generate power are much higher than we currently believe. Now, going back to your question on the actual cost of using solar or generally renewable energies, the common concept is that your upfront cost is significantly larger with renewable energies than it is with traditional power generation. So you would pay more upfront, but then enjoy lower operating costs in the generation of the electricity that you derive from natural resources, wind, sun, and perhaps hydro. Now, to come back to a point that Tristan touched on earlier on, and that is the ability of any power producer to generate a project on budget, and having put in question the current project that Eskom is busy with, and their ability to deliver those on budget. If you look at overseas, and unfortunately because we are tracking behind overseas for about more or less 10 years in the development of renewable energies, and we are forced to look at them in terms of having achieved that. In those countries, and let's use Central Europe as an example, France, Germany, and recently Italy and the UK, they have asked by and large the private sector to come up with those sources of renewable energy. In other words, independent power producers and in commercial producers of power. And because those are by and large commercial projects, they have a formidable track record of delivering their projects on budget. And I think that is something that should not be underestimated. When it comes to comparing traditional sources of power such as coal to renewable energies. Now, having said that, let's look at the actual facts and what the cost of renewable energies is. If you and taking into account the efforts that Eskom has gone through in the last few years to achieve energy efficiencies, if you factor in the very generous rebates and other subsidies that Eskom offers these days, the payback periods on solar water heating, for instance, have now come down, even for high-quality systems, to less than 4 years. So you can expect between 10 and 15 years of service. You have basically recovered your capital outlay after 3 to 4 years.
What does it actually cost, though, to put in a very basic geyser?
So looking at a normal 3 to 4 head family, looking at a traditional home, and looking at sort of a 200 litre solar water geyser, it would cost you between 15 and 20,000 rand at the end of the day to install it. Now, what you have to take into account with that is that your system is technologically more advanced, and that your system is going to last you longer than a traditional geyser. So put that into perspective and assume that you will operate your solar geyser for about 2 to 3 times as long as you would operate your traditional electric geyser, and that high upfront costs will be put into perspective.
Does Eskom not subsidize solar geysers any longer?
Indeed. And look, the program has really taken off in the past year or two. It had a slow start a few years ago. We're now up to well over 250,000. 285,000 solar geysers. We've actually got, we think, one of the world's biggest energy efficiency rebate programs. 57 million energy efficient light bulbs, and and the solar geyser program is really taking off, and I think that's really very encouraging. And it's not only something that's for affluent households. We have low pressure geysers which are for poor households, which basically with a rebate they get very close to free. And the thrust of the program there is to bring hot water to households who've in fact never had running hot water. So it has a quite a developmental, in terms of extending access to power, is quite important. And that really is a feature in this application as well, because there's general agreement that the poor do need to be protected. And within the tariff structure, we have made proposals which would certainly see the poorest households who use the least electricity face nothing like the average increase that we've applied for. And even for lower middle income customers, we seek to keep the price increases within single digits over the next 5 years, and that would be how we would want to see tariffs structured. There's quite a debate going on at the moment. NERSA has asked for input on its inclining block tariff system, which it introduced to protect the poor, which we have been implementing.
Hillary,
so those issues about how do you protect poorer households?
What about retirees?
The general principle is if you don't use very much electricity, you should pay lower rates. Now, we can speak only for Eskom's 4.5 or so million household customers. The other households in the country, we reckon we supply about 40% of South Africa's households directly as Eskom, and a lot of those are in former black townships because of the role which Eskom played in the electrification program, bringing electricity to 80% of the country, more than 80%, the census showed, since the early 1990s. Most former white areas, most metropolitan areas are supplied by municipalities, and we don't have control over their tariffs. But the same principles, I think, ought to be being followed, where if you use very little electricity, you should be paying at a lower rate, or paying a low flat rate or a low inclining rate. And certainly that is the proposal that is the approach the regulator has taken, and we have proposals which would simplify the system and make it more effective in targeting people who use very little.
Tristan, obviously Earthlife would like to see coal, well, not even touched. But you've got to be realistic to coal. We are heavily dependent on coal. I think Niels raised a very interesting statistic that after China, we're the second most reliant on coal. When you talk about renewable energy, realistically, how much time to phase that in, and at what cost? Because it seems very, very expensive to bring in.
Well, I think we've done studies, and we've shared these with Eskom, and there's been a variety of different studies in which you can go anywhere from 50 to 100% renewables in the next 30 to 40 years.
So is that your goal?
That's the time frame. I mean, I think anyone who realistically thinks that we're just going to shut off every single Eskom plant and magically, I don't know, build wind farms in our backyards or something, I mean, they're basically barking mad. But over a staggered period, we can get to a very high penetration of renewables in South Africa. Things like CSP are definitely the future in South Africa. Coal is not the future. We don't have the water. It's getting too expensive. And quite frankly, our climate and planet can't take it. I just want to come back to one thing that was previously said before we get a bit too gushy about Eskom's protection of the poor here. The Eskom increases to the poor will be higher than social grant increases. And I think that is the level which we are talking about of people, who are surviving on social grants. So it will be regressive on the poor people, even under the NYPD.
Define poor.
Well, if you take the 20 amp tariff, people who are living in townships, in informal settlements, squatter camps, the 40% of South Africans effectively who don't have work. Then you have the working poor as well, people who are earning 3,000-4,000 rand a month, spending half of that on transport, and then tariff increases on electricity come on top of that. So we must be very careful about that, and one of the better ways of dealing with it is to increase the free basic energy allocation, which is not being done in the NYPD. I mean, 50 kilowatts does not last poor families. So what we find is that poor families actually tend to be the most energy efficient in terms of electricity usage in South Africa, simply because they can't afford it. And what happens then is the costs of that unaffordability are transferred to the health costs of the nation. People burn chipboard in their houses. People burn wood with paint on it. I mean, this is what people call biomass in South Africa, but these are urban environments in which, you don't get firewood, you get scavenged biomass. People use paraffin. We have huge damage to our economy every year from paraffin burns. And this is what's been happening already. It was happening before the latest tariff increases is happening now, and we expect that to increase. So even though Eskom is saying that we're having a 9% increase to the poor people, it's not anywhere near what is required to address very deep and fundamental energy access issues.
We're going to take a short break and we'll continue that discussion. 15 minutes past 7. Classic Business and Classic Government is brought to you by Telkom. across the universe, far-flung galaxies and distant stars.
E.T. phone home.
The dusty plains of the African savannah.
You won't find him here! The king has returned.
And adventures in long-forgotten worlds.
Since you've been gone, the Red Queen has taken over all of Wonderland.
Let your imagination soar. The magic of the sounds of cinema. An hour of memories. Classic silver screen with me, Glenn Lewington, Monday to Thursday at 7:30 p.m. and Friday at 7. Classic FM presents Classic Silver Screen. (7:16) Classic Business and Classic Government is brought to you by Telkom. Tristan Taylor, Project Coordinator, Earthlife Africa, Johannesburg. You were making the point about the consideration of the poor and electricity supply, the inflation rate, that it actually is unfair to the poor. Thank you for defining who you regard as poor. And I'm going to ask you, retirees.
It depends on the retiree. I mean, if you've retired to help pay, I'm not going to call you poor. If you are on a government pension, you know, you've got maybe a place in the Eastern Cape, you've been working or not working in Gauteng, and you've gone home there. You are definitely poor. You're on a very, very tight budget.
Now, do you not believe, and we've all been singing the praises of NERSA, the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, would address it? Hillary says it has to go before them.
Well, no. NERSA takes its mandate very narrowly at the moment. It takes its mandate as does Eskom make profit or not. I mean, that is essentially NERSA's mandate, and it tries to, on the margins, do that. I think NERSA has a lot more power than it thinks it has, and it must actually applicate and use that power. So, for example, why do certain municipalities give 100 kilowatt hours free? Eskom only gives 50. Why can't we have 100 or 200 kilowatt hours free for every domestic user, and then have a very high inclining block for rich users?
Hillary, are you taking notes?
I have a report which I can give.
I'm taking notes, but I think we're going a bit beyond the scope of the MIPD3 application, because these are really policy issues. The free basic electricity is a government policy approach. It is implemented differently by different municipalities and Eskom, but the broad framework is something which is kind of quite out of the scope of a tariff application. And if I may defend the regulator for a moment, though I don't think NERSA needs any defense, I think they do quite a lot more than just look at whether Eskom makes a profit or not. They take their task very seriously, and I certainly said this morning was a lengthy discussion of the rules and the methodology with all sorts of people challenging them. I think they do take their job quite seriously, and their remit is quite broad.
And if NERSA turned around and said, Eskom, you can't have 16%, what do you do?
NERSA turns around and says, Eskom, this is what you can have, and this is what we have.
So you abide by...
We absolutely, there's no political decision making above that. The NERSA decision is the electricity tariff.
If they don't approve that and they give you a lower tariff, now you've obviously worked out that you need 16%. Where would the money come from to make up? Say they turned around and said 14%. Where does the extra 2% come from?
We have to be able to cover our operating costs, but we also have to be able to support the financing of the capital spending that we're doing, which is very, very significant. We will be spending over 330 billion on expanding our capacity and on upgrading our networks and our capacity over the next 5 years. Now, how do we finance that? These are assets. We finance them with debt. We already have 180 billion of debt on our balance sheet, and that will double during the 5 years. We have a very, very large interest bill which we have to meet. And if we are to be in a position to raise the finance on the markets, local and international, at cost-effective rates, we have to have the kind of credit ratings which will enable us to access those markets at cost-effective rates. So I think the application is designed to get us to a standalone investment grade rating, which is quite important. An investment grade rating is quite important for Eskom. At the moment, we depend on government support to get that investment grade rating, because our own financial metrics on their own would not give us an investment grade rating. So I think quite an important part of this application when we talk about financial sustainability is to ensure that we can, as Eskom and indeed as an electricity industry, access the kind of funding which is needed to make sure that we can invest in the future.
So basically, that application of 16% is what Eskom needs to survive for the now.
We believe it is what our best estimate of how we balance the country's needs and our needs to ensure that we can perform our mandate of providing a secure supply and supporting economic growth.
Niels, you had a point.
Glenn, just taking into account what Hilary said, and going back to a point you made earlier when you quoted Ellis, who said that we don't live in the world that we lived 25 years ago anymore. And I do think that NERSA is very well aware of that. So, in other words, NERSA knows that Eskom is not just coming to them to ask for more money at the end of the day. They know that they require more rands per kilowatt hour generated to cover their costs. They're required to adopt new technologies. They require it to make their power generation more clean. And as an absolute bold proponent of renewable energies, we support that, and we need an increase in the cost of electricity. It is very important to understand that South Africa still has one of the lowest costs of electricity compared globally. And to go back to the point and the question that you asked earlier, how much we really can generate by using renewable energies and how expensive it would be, really. Let's explore what other countries have done to put this into perspective. Our current available generation in South Africa, or Eskom's generation, taking into account a little bit of IPP that we have already, is about 31 gigawatt. Right. In 2011, Germany, as one example, added 7.5 gigawatts of PV, and I'm talking PV only, not taking into account wind. So in a half a year's 6 months' time, Germany has added 10% of the South African capacity to their network. In May, we had a sunny weekend. Germany generated 50% of electricity used from renewable energy sources in Germany. That means they generated the equivalent of 8 nuclear power plants output by using photovoltaics and by using wind power. Now, the German consumer is charged for that generation at the end of the day, similar to what NERSA is doing in South Africa. They have obviously gone much further in the generation or building of renewable energy sources, and let's look at how expensive it is to the German consumer. In Germany, the overall cost of electricity factors in about 8% for renewable energies. So the consumer pays 8% of a premium to have 35 gigawatts of PV power to the network. If you translate that into more tangible figures, in South Africa, if you build a large PV plant and you operate it for 25 years, which is now guaranteed by the builders of these power plants due to the amount of R&D that goes into the building and assembly manufacture of solar panels at the end of the day, you can generate power at a levelized cost which takes into account the future development of operating costs. You can now generate your power at a stable amount of about 40 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour. That is what your operating cost and your cost of generation will be over the span of 25 years for a solar plant. And that is phenomenal if you take into account the societal costs that we've referred to earlier, if you take into account that coal is becoming more expensive every year, if you take into account the Sandies of this world, or the hailstorms we had in Edenvale, and all those environmental costs of using coal to really generate our electricity. So at the end of the day, my stance is that it is achievable, both in capacity as well as in terms of financial viability for the South African consumer.
Interesting. Claire?
I definitely think that we need to be considering all of our options. I think for us to focus too much on any one generation capacity is probably foolhardy, considering how energy intensive our South Africa is generally. Whether or not in the short term we can do that from renewable energy, I'm not sure. But I think that as storage technology for renewable energy becomes more efficient and less costly, it's definitely going to become more and more of an option. Unfortunately, the reality is that in South Africa we have large coal reserves, and this is the most immediate source that we can rely on.
And it employs literally thousands of people.
Absolutely, and with the new discoveries of gas and developments outside of South Africa, where we are looking at sharing and selling and buying power from other countries, there are always opportunities for us to increase the amount of electricity that we're getting from less environmentally damaging, technologies. But I think, the reality is that we have the coal, and we have almost an obligation at the moment to exploit it as much as we can until other technologies become more reliable, because we have to continue growing and developing, and it's just, that is where our power is going to come from.
Claire, if I can ask you a question as well, based on when people criticize Eskom, do you think they ever confuse the municipal supplier, Eskom, the Department of Energy, and NERSA, 4 very different entities?
Absolutely. I hear with great interest about how Eskom is responsible for the fact that we don't have enough generation capacity. And, there was a decision taken in I think it was the early 2000s by the Department of Energy that any new capacity would be built by independent power producers. And we then found ourselves in a situation where our legal and regulatory frameworks didn't allow for independent power producers to come into South Africa. And then, of course, there was a situation where our tariffs were so low that there was no ways that it would be an enticing market for them anyway. And it was only when we really got to near crisis stage that Eskom was then given the mandate to go ahead and build. And I think, a lot of policy decisions are confused as Eskom decisions. For instance, the fact that Eskom's mandate, and Hillary, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but their current mandate as far as generation capacity is concerned only extends to Medupi, Kusile, and Ngula. After that, they are entirely dependent on the government saying this is where your next projects will be. Because, at the end of the day, they are also still a servant of the people. I think it's sometimes very difficult to separate out, if you're not involved in the industry, where the responsibilities lie.
Absolutely. Claire, we're going to leave it there. Claire Falkvein, Program Director for African Utility Week. If I may ask my remaining guests, if you can, very briefly, just sum up where you'd like to see the country in, and as we say, it's been fascinating. I thought 300 years, but let's say 2030. What is South Africa's electricity supply going to look like? Tristan, how do you think it's going to look?
Hopefully it'll be a very clean non-coal supply. If we do not change our carbon emissions patterns, we are heading towards a 5 to 6 degrees warming by the end of this century, and that's mass extinction level event. We're talking death and destruction. So hopefully we can transition away from that.
Hillary?
We would like to see all South Africans have access to electricity, because even though we've done well as a country and as Eskom, and it's now 83% according to the census, there's still 2 or 3 million households who don't have access to electricity. So that's really quite important for us, and we would like to see, we've been connecting 150,000 a year to the grid, but we'd like to see that speed up. We would like to see a cleaner energy mix. We would like to see a successful country which can grow much faster than we're growing now, and which has the infrastructure and the electricity to support that growth. And I think we would like to see more power coming also from the region, so that we can help supply cleaner power and more power, not only for South Africans' own needs, but also to power the Southern African region as a whole.
Thanks, Hillary. Niels?
Glenn, let's go back to the reserves that South Africa has. And we always talk about our natural reserves, meaning coal, platinum, gold, and so on and so forth. We have amongst the most formidable conditions for natural generation of power. We have an incredibly long coastline with very strong and stable and consistent winds. We have the best solar irradiation profile in many countries. And all of those really create the best environment for a lot of our power to be generated using these resources. They generate avail us with the possibilities of employing a lot of people and giving employment that is currently lost in other sectors of our manufacturing environment to the servicing the needs of the power user, and that is by using natural resources for the generation of power. So what we see is And what we wish for is a proportion of about 40 to 45% of green power. And what we also envision is about 500,000 jobs in the green industry by 2030. And it is very achievable. Germany has over 500,000 jobs in the green industry as it stands today. And we have about 18 years to catch up with Germany on that one. So I'm very optimistic into that. And we would like the government to create the environment in which people are allowed to build solar plants, to operate them, to sell their power as they want to, and thus achieve that objective. Thank you.
Hilary Joffe, spokesperson, Eskom, Tristan Taylor, Project Coordinator, EarthLife Africa, Johannesburg, Niels van Hazer, CEO, Solsquare, and Claire Volkvein, Program Director for African Utility Week. Thank you for your time on Classic Business and Classic Government, brought to you by Telkom. Thanks to the team that produces the program. That also brings us to the end of this week's topic, and that's Eskom and the future of electricity in our generation in our country. Tomorrow night, 6 o'clock, our short business news, Classic Business. From me, Glenn Lewington, thanks for listening. I'll be back with you in just a moment with Classic Silver Screen. Good night.
On Sunday, the 4th of November, MTN and Classic FM present a program of contemporary and classical works with the rising young stars, soprano Vanessa Tate-Jones and saxophonist Abraham Menon. The program will include works by George Gershwin, Jerome Kern, Richard Strauss, and South African composers P.J. Lemmer and Pieter de Villiers. Don't miss this performance with Vanessa Tate-Jones and Abraham Menon, winners of the 2011 National Atiekapia Musicanto and Music competitions. The MTN Classic Soiree takes place on Sunday, the 4th of November at Summer Place at 6 p.m. Enjoy a delicious 3-course meal paired with South African wines. Tickets are priced from 350 rands. Book now at CompuTicket.